Welcome everyone to this webinar of the Linguistics Society of America. Today we have the second installment in our In Case You Missed It series, in which we feature presenters and topics from our recent annual meeting. Today we are pleased to welcome Claire Bowen, Irene Yee, and Sarah Babinski, who will present their talk, How Usable Are Digital Collections for Endangered Languages? A Review. In this 90-minute webinar, our panelists will give a presentation for just over an hour, after which they will respond to your questions in a Q&A session. You can submit your questions at any time using the control panel on your screen. And so without any further ado, I will turn this webinar over to our presenters.
Great, thanks, Mark, and thank you very much to the audience for being here today. I'm going to start off this presentation before handing over to Irene and Sarah, who are going to present different aspects of this work. We are here as representatives of a much larger research group, which includes Cassandra Hackman, Jeremiah Jewell, Juhei Kim, and Amelia Lake. And this work was conducted as part of the Chirela Historical Linguistics Lab at Yale University in the Department of Linguistics. So here's a photo of some of the other presenters as well who are unable to be here today, but they are very much contributors to this work as well. So today, what we are going to do is present a summary of our findings of a review of archives and archival collections for endangered languages. And this work was presented at 2 talks at the 2022 LSA annual meeting in DC, hybrid and in person. And so here we've kind of combined these 2 talks together and responded to some of the questions and feedback we got during the LSA to talk about accessibility, discoverability, and functionality, an audit of and recommendations for digital language archives, and also how usable digital collections are for endangered languages. So that is, we're looking at kind of 2 different levels, collections of endangered languages and the archives that host those collections. And we're going to examine some of the different features, different issues that arise when thinking about access to collections at the archival level, for instance, through web portals and things like that, but also what sorts of things are brought up when individual depositors make choices about what they archive and how they archive. This is pilot data. It's a relatively small set of data collection findings at the moment, but we felt that these findings were striking enough to present them at this point and use that as the opportunity to get your feedback, to start a discussion amongst the many different groups who have a stake in making the best archival resources possible, and also something of a call to action, because we were quite concerned about the sorts of findings we found. So your feedback is absolutely crucial here. I'm going to start by giving a bit of a background on language archives before handing over to Irene, who's going to talk about collections, and who's going to talk about archives, and Sarah, who's going to talk about collections. So first of all, I've been talking about archives and endangered languages without really defining what I've been talking about. So far, we might, so we know that somewhere between 1/3 and half of the world's languages are under some sort of pressure at the moment, in that their speakers and signers are unable to use these languages in the full range of ways that that they would like to, and are prevented from transmitting their languages in the full way that that they would that they would like to. So this is typically what we call endangered languages. Many endangered languages have some sort of language documentation associated with them, or digital collections, digital materials available on the internet in some ways. Of course, many don't, but many do as well. And over the past 15 to 20 years or so, digital language documentation in particular, so digital recordings, digitizations of field notes, digital video, and so on and so forth, has increasingly become the standard for the type of work, format in which language records are made. However, these digital archives or digital repositories for these works are very decentralized and vary in standards and quality, as do the collections made themselves. And so we felt it was time to think about these sorts of things explicitly. I've also been using the term archive without further definition or explanation, and this is going to be relevant to what we talk about later on as well. So in the broadest sense, an archive is a repository of language data, or a repository of the physical or digital media that the language is stored on. Okay, and it's a repository created with the aim of preserving and disseminating those materials in particular collections. Okay, Peter Austin in a 2021 presentation has defined 4 different ways, or 4 different primary functions of archives. The first is to appraise materials, so to make decisions about what is archived and what is not in that particular archives collection, to preserve those collections long term, to make those the existence of those collections discoverable, so to tell others about what is in those collections and what are in the archives holdings, and to facilitate the appropriate distribution of such language materials as well. So basically, archives collect materials, they decide what to collect, they collect what they've decided to collect, they keep those materials safe, they tell others about what they have, and they make it possible for others to have appropriate access to those materials as well. Now, in a digital framework, digital language archives have both advantages and disadvantages in comparison to more physical language records. So we could think, for instance, of everything from clay tablets to paper and parchment to wax cylinder recordings to digital format materials as well. So we have a very wide, and others as well. So we have a very wide set of materials that languages are currently preserved in. The pros of digital language archives include things like the storage is much more compact than analog materials. You can see the large collection of books behind me, and the amount of storage space that would take up on a single hard drive, for example. Digital material can be more easily manipulated than physical media, language materials for republication or reanalysis and so on. Via the internet, there is much wider potential for accessibility of language data. Compare downloading a file from the internet compared to posting a clay tablet or a piece of paper, for example. Files also may be theoretically copied an infinite number of times without altering the original. So if I want to make a photocopy of a medieval piece of parchment, for instance, the process of making that photocopy exposes the pigments on the parchment to light that over time will degrade the original. Whereas in theory, at least, with copying digital media formats, we can just copy and copy and nothing changes with respect to the original. In practice, however, so those are the pros, there are also a number of disadvantages of digital media. The electronic storage media have very poor longevity compared to the thousands of years of clay tablets or the hundreds of years of parchment, for example. Digital storage media are vulnerable to environmental conditions, data corruption, server issues, internet outages, and so on, which make the accessibility of such materials and the longevity of such materials much less in practice than we might think of as theoretically possible. There's also long-term readability and changing technology issues that make the access to the materials, the files, and so on stored on the physical media much less reliable than we might expect. So on the other side of this computer, for instance, there is a stack of digital hard drives on a bookshelf where at the moment, probably most of those collections are readable, but they contain files that go back to versions of Word from the early 90s, for instance, which are no longer readable or openable with any of the technology that is easily accessible. Okay, so this brings us then to the problem that digital language corpora are very heterogeneous, and our standards for making recordings were kind of informally formalized 15 years ago or so, or at least prior to the development of many subsequent digital language manipulations. So for instance, on this computer, I can make spectrograms of sound recordings, I can force align transcripts to audio files, and none of that was possible with at the time that audio recordings that I work with regularly were created. We also focus in our linguistic training on producing materials for archives, but there's much less focus on working with collections which have already been archived, and others have made this point as well. So not everyone says this, but on balance, there is a greater focus on the process of archiving rather than the process of using materials that have been archived. And so simply, we don't know how usable archived collections really are and how to improve them. And we need to figure this out now, given the how much language material is already in archives and how many languages are under pressure. Okay. When we think about the data life cycle, when we think about the acquisition of data, the manufacture or analysis of data, and the diffusion or publication of data, as people like Gonzalez et al. And Rehm have talked about, where's archiving in that cycle? Sometimes it's thought to be part of the acquisition phase, but at the same time, when people talk about the acquisition phase, they often or usually mean from language users, from the speakers or signers of the languages under study. So we want to put archiving more explicitly in this cycle as well. I want to make a couple of caveats as well before we move on to the findings of our surveys. That in this talk, we are going to be somewhat critical of both some archives and of depositors. And we recognize that archives often don't receive the funding they need, and they rely on a great deal of volunteer energy and labor to function. And as field workers and people who work with archives in many different ways, both as depositors and users of collections and to a limited extent as archivists ourselves, we really truly appreciate the work that our colleagues do, the large amount of volunteer work, or work that is maybe peripherally part of their job, but well and truly they go above and beyond for that. So we do not want to have this seen as a criticism of any individuals, and we recognize that there are a very wide array of circumstances that lead researchers to make the decisions they do about how things are archived, where they are archived, and what the archives look like. We also very firmly believe that a collection that is incomplete but archived is preferable to not archived at all, because not archived at all still retains all of the issues around that we identify in archival collections, but is much more fragile as well. And as linguists who work with communities who are reclaiming their languages in large part from archival collections because of breakdowns in communication with individual linguists and so on, we truly appreciate that archives have a very important role to play here. As academic linguists, we don't represent all opinions and views around archive uses, so we bring up some things that we've noticed and that we've talked about with colleagues and endangered language community members and so on, but this is an incomplete review of the issues. But nonetheless, we think it's important to ask these questions and bring them up, given how important and irreplaceable language materials are that these archives hold. Okay, because we do not want to name names and cast blame on individuals, mostly we are not providing individual examples of the issues that we bring up, and in some cases we've actually we've replicated rather than manufactured the issues that we've seen with collections to anonymize the source of these issues. We're going to be talking about issues that seem to be happening on a wide scale, and we want to raise these issues for the purpose of future archivists and depositors' work, rather than to cast blame or call attention to individuals at this point. I'm actually going to skip the previous discussion in the interests of time, but I did want to note that the work we are doing here follows on from many previous previous publications and other work. This is a very small sample of the work that has been done on these topics already, based on centering users, on the responsibilities of archives, on disseminating results of archives, on what is archived in the the first place, and in using archives in language reclamation. And so I refer you to all of these papers and many others. And we're trying to bring this all together and look at the state of where we are for now. You'll notice that the years of publication for some of these papers go back right to the early years of migration to primarily digital formats. And so we have been talking about many of the questions we bring up for a very long time, and that's worth noting as well. So with that, we are now going to turn to a review of archives, and Irene is going to talk about characteristics of archives, accessibility, discoverability, and functionality. Irene is then going to hand over to Sarah to talk about collections and archives versus collections, data cleaning issues and issues that prevented or impeded the use of individual collections, and then I'll return for general reflections and conclusions. So we are all here in the same office, so we're going to switch over to Irene now.
Hi, thanks, Claire. So we are moving on to the review of archives. The review that we have, we looked at about 50 archives from an end user perspective. Sorry, 1 second. Okay, so the issues that we looked at were in accessibility and findability, including which languages a user needs to know in order to navigate sites properly and be able to access collections, and then were there any aspects of the site design that impeded or promoted accessibility of these materials. We also looked at discoverability, which was how available is the material in the collections. If it is not freely available, what must be done in order to access it. And we recognize there are types of controls in place, and so we wanted to investigate what the reasons for those controls were and how easy it is to find information that you need from the archive sites. Finally, we looked at functionality. We looked just at if there are aspects of the site and archive design that promoted or impeded the use of materials. So now moving on to the results of this review of archives, we first want to make a note on the scope of archives that we looked at. So we looked at a wide array of archives, and so they varied in size. Some of the archives we looked at contained 1 or 2 collections, and it ranged from a small size to a major regional or global holding archive. The scope of collections ranged from local, regional, or a global focus. And we also only were looking at the language materials as compared to other forms of culture that is related to language that can be housed in archives, for example, music. We also want to note the relationship to the physical archives of the archives that we looked at. So some of these archives were a site that had materials, and the physical materials were housed in a stewardship institution somewhere, in a university somewhere, something like that. And so we wanted to make a note of that. And we also want to make note that the archives that we looked at varied in the personnel, the resources that they had in order to maintain these archives, so in terms of personnel and funding, and whether or not they were housed within a larger body like a university or museum, or if they were just a self-standing archive. Okay, so the first issue we looked at was accessibility. Accounts and registration is the first tier of accessibility of any archive or any website. Here we go. Some archives were open access, and some required at most free account registration. Let me just minimize this window. So there were different tiers of restriction. There was open access, whether some required free account registration, and some also required special permission to access certain collections in the archives. This can be cumbersome, though it's not a prohibitive measure usually to have registration or permission access. But some of the cumbersome things that we ran into were that some of the account registration was built into Google Forms. So if you forgot a password or if you lost your password, that couldn't be retrieved. And so you had to make an entirely new account. Additionally, some of the account registration took days or hours to process. Some required mailing in physical forms. And yeah, that, physical forms are not all researchers have that time to do that. Many archives appropriately restricted the access for the to respect the wishes of language communities and researchers, but not all archives streamlined this process or provided clear contact information for who to contact in order to get permission or access to a collection. Some of these archives and collections could only be accessed through institutional emails, for example, like a university email that ends in edu, and some were password protected. And while this provides access to academics, we have to wonder what language communities who are not affiliated with academic institutions are losing out in terms of access to these cultural materials, especially for purposes of language pedagogy and language reclamation. So the next thing we looked at was interface language. Only 14 of the archives we looked at, about 1/3, offered more than one language interface. Interface language is a very important aspect of accessibility. The languages that were available for interface languages were strongly biased towards European or well-resourced languages. And plugging sites into Google Translate does not fully translate the site, and we'll show some issues with that in a second. So translations can often be inaccurate, and sometimes, in some cases, the translation removed functionality. For example, the ability to expand lists or removed links. The majority of digital resources available to Indigenous users were largely in English, which is problematic because English is not a first language for many, and also this further exacerbates existing divides in Indigenous communities where access to English language knowledge remains a critical issue. Moving on, we point to Paradisec as a great example of an archive that makes its content available not only in multiple languages, but in languages that are very relevant to a specific region. So this interface is in Bislama, but they also have options for Tok-Pisin and some other languages, and that is great given that it focuses on Australian Oceanic languages. So here was an issue that we had with translations and plugging sites into Google Translate and such. So in this example, some of the names were transliterated but not others. This is in Uzbek, but you can see that the name James Woodward is not transliterated, and that divorces the person's name from the collections. Yes. Here we go. This is another example in Kyrgyz where this View 16 More button was no longer worked. It was no longer clickable with the Google Translate overlay if you plug the site into Google Translate. This is another example also in Kyrgyz. And we can see here that the word elicitation is translated in some instances, but not in others. And then the green open buttons were not translatable. Okay, so another issue of accessibility is disability accommodations. This is very important, and not only of archives, but of just any other website. It is essential that archives are designed in a way that is accessible to users who rely on assistive technology to navigate the internet. Since we are not experts in this and we are not experienced in using screen readers to navigate the internet, we felt that we were not able to properly survey archives for their compatibility with screen readers. And yeah, this would not have been an honest reflection of our understanding of it. But nevertheless, we strongly recommend that principles of accessible web design, which have long been standardized, should be followed. The archives that we looked at, most of them were colorblind friendly. They were friendly to users with color deficiencies, but if you suffered from low contrast, here, okay, there we go. Some of the archives suffered from low contrast visibility between the font and the background color. So if that was something that you suffered from in your visual impairment, that would impede the accessibility of the archive. But these issues are pretty easily rectified in terms of the overall scope of web design. So we strongly recommend that archives follow the standards of accessible web design. So overall, our recommendations in accessibility of archives include broadly streamlining the process for account registration and permission requests, implementing a wider array of interface and display languages, especially those relevant to local researchers and language communities, and again, following the principles of accessible web design. So the next issue that we looked at in archives was the discoverability. So one thing for this was we looked at search functions and mislabeling of archives. So here we go. Users often were not able to see information about a collection before accessing it and opening it, which makes browsing archive lists more cumbersome. Additionally, collections also frequently do not outwardly indicate the size or the types of files they store. And again, you have to click into the collection to find out more about it. Also, the ability to perform searches within collections was absent for most archives. And searches were often hampered by missing metadata, incorrect tags, and case sensitivity in some issues. Because of the search function impediments, this sometimes allowed some collections to disappear in certain searches, even if they were relevant to what you were searching for. And only 5 archives allowed users to filter searches by media and file type. This would hamper researchers who are looking for specific types of files. And finally, sometimes EAF files were mislabeled as XML files. And so now we point to an example of an archive that did a very good job of allowing the sort of filtering and searching by file type. So this is the Alaska Native Language Archive, and this picture shows that it allows to search by text or audio or both. Next, we move on to issues with metadata. So we saw some problems in metadata and how they were recorded. There was little consistency between archives and how much or what kind of metadata is offered, as well as how it's displayed, even within archive collections. This varied wildly, and the sort of metadata, so the sort of metadata provided varied wildly, and that made navigation difficult because metadata also affects the searching for collections. Sometimes the metadata was layered and nested, so there would be metadata for the whole collection or metadata for individual folders, and then metadata for individual files. Okay, and then we looked at site maintenance. Some sites required Yale VPN access, and for us, we were researching through Yale, and there were still some unresolved connection issues and inconsistencies between our access with this. And additionally, some sites still required Adobe Flash Player, which was discontinued as of 2020 and blocked as of January 2021. So accessing these sites is now impossible. Server loss and a movement of websites can cause data loss, specifically if a website is not maintained properly and the Wayback Machine does not capture the sufficient snapshots to fully restore lost archives. And it often doesn't maintain links, so they're no longer clickable. And many archives also suffered from pervasive broken links, which also made navigation extremely difficult. Yes, here is an image of something that requires Adobe Flash Player still. Okay, so our recommendations for that, we recommend that archives offer more clear and detailed descriptions of collection contents and more consistent metadata, and allow users to search by file type, and also just to ensure the correct labeling of file types. So the last thing we looked at in archives was the functionality. So one thing that we looked at for this was the site content, as well as the structure and the download abilities. So critically, most of the archives we looked at offered no option to bulk download collections. And this means that large collections were virtually unusable, and even smaller collections often were very time consuming to like individually go through and download each thing by clicking on it manually. So additionally, the file downloads sometimes caused the loss of nested file structure, which is problematic for large collections. This can make it unsustainably time consuming to find the matched content. Yeah, when audio and transcription and translations are stored as separate files. And for this, our recommendations are to offer bulk download options, but we also understand that bulk download options sometimes are not available to respect community wishes. But to counter that, we we recommend at least offering the option of shopping cart downloads. So you can choose which files you want and then use one button to click the download of that, rather than having to still go through and individually collect or click through all of the individual collections you wish to download. So now we're moving on to the interim summary before we move on to our review of collections. So as Claire was talking about earlier, we use Austin 2021's definitions of what an archive's functions should be. So now we're going to go back to see whether or not the archives that we looked at, fulfill these functions. So the first thing for appraising materials, it is unknown from the website of the archive. Sometimes it is unknown for what materials were appraised unless you individually go through and look at them. And for preserving these materials long-term, these methods were unknown. We do not know whether or not even the digital materials are preserved long-term. And again, like we said with the Wayback Machine, it's really important that there's somewhere that these digital materials are preserved long-term, even if the sites are no longer maintained or down. And yeah, the methods are known to be heterogeneous, so transparency on archive sites in that sense would be important and beneficial. Yeah. And making their existence discoverable was variable, as we saw with the archives that we looked at, and facilitating their appropriate distribution was also variable from the sites that we looked at from our findings of discoverability and functionality and accessibility. And so now we're going to move on to Sarah in our review of collections.
Great. So, so Irene just told us all about our review of archives and archive sites and the sort of overarching structures. But we also looked at a handful of individual collections. So let's talk a bit about archives and collections. So in terms of using archival collections, we sort of think of it as there being two broad constituencies. One is the group of people who work with speakers and signers, make language records, and put them into archives. So there's sort of that perspective of, getting your materials together and organizing them, and then getting them into the archive. And then there is the group that is more likely to be taking material from archives to study it, talk about it with people, create language learning materials, do broad research studies, and things like that. But really, there is not a lot of guidance for either of these groups. So documentary linguists have tended to think of archiving as the endpoint after planning and conducting fieldwork. As you can see in this, this flow chart here, send to archive is right at the bottom, and there's sort of no further detail after that. Rather than thinking about the archival collections as input to further work. So on top of there often not being a lot of standards or guidance for the people creating the archival collections, there's also not a lot of guidance about how to use these collections and a sort of inconsistency in the way that collections are organized that sort of contributes to the issue. So the aims of our collection review. So the sort of big question that we are concerned with is, how does current archival data work as input to rather than output of research? So what current archiving practices facilitate or impede the use of digital corpora, whether these are digitized or natively digital materials? What additional cyber infrastructure tools might we need in order to achieve this? How do we build in community-oriented resources for language research, teaching, and reclamation from our archival corpora to make these a part of the process of linguistic research? And how can these corpora sustainably serve language documentation aims and language reclamation? So in terms of others finding your work 30 years from now, you know, how useful can they find it? Will they be able to, you know, create reclamation programs and similar things from your materials? And we also wanted to sort of address this issue that's sort of common in a lot of working with a lot of data. This sort of phrase, data were extensively cleaned. So we see some examples here. This is often just a single sentence, just noting that a lot of data processing went into getting the data in the right format in order to do whatever the study is about. But there's often not a lot of detail about that. So another goal we have in this talk is to sort of unpack that a little bit and talk more specifically about what we had to do in order to get things into a usable form. Okay, so let's get into the methods and the data that we had for the collections. Our audit methods, we used a top-down approach. So we randomly selected collections from archives. You know, semi-randomly, we tried to have sort of a spread over the globe and using different archives and things like that. But we didn't really have any knowledge of what was in these collections in the beginning. We wanted to know what information is available in each collection. So like what metadata is available, what format is that in, what sort of audio material is there, and how much. How usable are the collection materials for forced alignment, which we'll talk about a bit on the next slide. So we wanted to look at forced alignment in particular because we decided it was a good sort of test for checking for a certain quality of recording because there's sort of a threshold of quality that you need in order to perform forced alignment. And it's really a good stress test for collection. So it requires quality of audio and file formats. It allows testing of file corruption, transcription accuracy and compatibility, and file consistency. And having forced alignment pipeline lets us ensure that we have a consistent type of data that meets a certain standard. And also a note about forced alignment is that It's a really great tool for speeding things up and avoiding this transcription bottleneck where, transcription takes 10 to 50, 100 times longer than actually recording materials. And so it's really useful to have aligned tiers for documentation, and forced alignment can be very helpful for that. Yeah, and also creates a searchable corpus in the end. So the data that we used, we looked at 20 collections from 6 popular archives. Again, we're not really going into details about which collections these were. We only did 20 because we're a relatively small group and we did not have special funding for this. So that's basically the story for that. And we looked specifically to have a worldwide distribution. So here's all of the location of the languages of the collections that we looked at. And you can see we have a pretty decent spread across continents and regions. Okay, so some of our results. So there were some problems in these collections that just completely made it impossible to work any further towards forced alignment or other phonetic work. So of the 20 collections that we looked at, 14 actually had no available sound files. Usually this is because the collection in general was accessible, but it was actually partially accessible. And this, was only sort of found out after the fact. 11 collections had irreconcilable metadata, so it was just impossible to know what was in it, where to find things, how to match up files, how to match up sound files to transcriptions, for example. And 4 had unprocessable transcripts. So this includes transcripts built into a web audio player or in an unparsable XML file, or the transcripts were just incomplete. And in addition to this, there were also some problems that were recoverable, but just added to processing time overall. So out of the 11 that we were actually able to use at all, 8 didn't have matching metadata to files or had different file names. So in some cases, this is just a difference between an underscore versus a hyphen, which is fine for a human looking at things. But if you're trying to run any kind of scripting, having fully identical file names and in some cases knowing exactly what these file names are is very important. There was inconsistent tier use in like transcript tiers, whether it's the order of the tiers or the labeling of them or things like that. And out of the 5 collections that had transcripts in Elon, 2 of them had no preserved Elon offsets, which means that the transcripts were not automatically aligned correctly at the beginning of the file, which sort of throws everything off, so they had to be manually realigned. And just to note that these findings are, in addition to the variation that we expect as a natural result of languages as social objects, just being different from one another because of that. And these problems were not foreseeable at the time, but they did emerge, in retrospect throughout our review, which really shows the importance of doing this kind of work and looking at archives and collections systematically. So that all said, starting off with 20 collections, 3 of them were successfully aligned. And so at this point, we want to go a little more into detail about this after the data were substantially cleaned, sort of catchphrase. So some things we had to do, some file renaming in order to get things to match up. In order to run the forced alignment, we had to do some version control in terms of like different versions of the same file. We had to do matching of transcripts to audio files, where in some cases it wasn't very straightforward what matched up to what. We had to remove non-transcript items from the transcription line, such as notes or things that just weren't actually the transcription. And we had to deal with font and character encodings, as well as grapheme to phoneme conversion problems. And there's more than this as well, which we can talk about later. Those were the big ones. Okay, and here's some examples of some of the things that we ran into. So version control, a lot of times, you know, people have a file and then they save a new file that is the updated version, and then they name it something else. And this is a big problem for trying to match things up. So here's an example. Here at the top, we have files that are all have the same like code at the beginning, so we assume they're the same thing. But in the case of the WAV file, it's just the regular file name. And then we have a elan file that matches up to that name. And then we also have one with -rev, so like revised. So obviously we want the revised one because that's probably more complete. But if we're running a script, the one that's going to get matched up is the old one, which may be, you know, may really have not a lot of transcription in it. And a similar thing here. In this case, the settings file is also not reproduced in the final version, so that can cause issues as well. And some of the font and encoding issues that we came across. So there were some stray non-printing characters, such as non-breaking spaces or a single Chinese characters, things like this, as well as encoding conversion issues. So for example, legacy Mac files are sometimes incorrectly saved as Unicode. And there were delimiters in the wrong places. So tabs within records, which again is something that is not very distracting to a human, but is a really big deal for a script because tabs are often used as a meaningful delimiter. So it can screw up the reading of files. Yeah, and in a lot of cases, these are, you know, fixable, recoverable things. In terms of the encoding conversion errors, you know, you have to know what the issue is and how to fix it. So it's like a little bit of a specialist problem, but it certainly impedes things, if not like would dissuade someone from actually using the file if they didn't know what was going on. And here is another example that came up quite a bit, where there is an elan transcription file associated with the audio and everything seems great, and then you download it and it's actually just some aligned phrases, I assume, but there's no text, there's no actual transcription. You know, and of course it's better to archive something that is incomplete than not archive it at all. We really want to stress that, but yeah, there's this is one of the big issues we came across that meant that we couldn't fully process a lot of these collections. Okay, so an interim summary about the collections investigation. So some of our recommendations, we want to emphasize consistency and accuracy in file naming practices, data descriptions, and transcription practices. These practices might be standardized within a collection, even without archive setting protocols, which can be tricky because there may be a wide variety of collection types that makes standardization difficult, but internally consistent collections are very useful as well. It would be great to include rich metadata, such as date of recording, speaker information, information about the recording equipment used, like any information that is known at the time could be useful to someone trying to use these materials. And include settings files for like the elan transcriptions, for example. Yeah, archiving is not just the raw data, and the settings files, you know, can make or break actually being able to open up and look at a transcription. And we need to look into further collections. Of course, we only looked at 20, and every collection, as we found through this and through other work that some of us have done, brings different problems. So we certainly have not uncovered everything that can go wrong or that could be improved upon. But of course, we are dealing with a lack of funding for investigating these issues at the time. So that's why we're just presenting these preliminary results. So some general recommendations before we get more into general conclusions. Be as consistent as you can while you're working, and document your decisions, both for yourself and for archive users. You know, it's always useful to make notes of things so that when you go back a year later, you'll remember that, you know, why you made a certain decision. While archiving, ask yourself, does this file need to be there, especially if you have multiple versions of the same thing? You know, you probably just want to include the most complete one, you know, not having the same file over and over again with just different names. And do some tests on your archive material. So, you know, pretend that you don't know about the structure and see if you can find everything that you need. See if things are pretty straightforwardly organized. Yeah, you know, keeping in mind the users of a collection. And for the future, we also would like to see better infrastructure for corpus processing, such as validation checks, so that there can be some sort of automated way to check all of your files, make sure everything is, you know, usable and things don't get corrupted and things like that. Okay, so for the last bit of this talk, I will turn it over to Claire again for conclusions.
Cool, thanks very much, Sarah. So we're going to have general conclusions, I guess. So I want to go back to our archive definition that Austin 2021 gave us with the 4 aspects of what archives do, and ask whether archives are fulfilling their mission and are depositors helping with that as well. So for example, with appraising materials, of course, archives choose what they collect and where the focus of their collection and curation will be, but depositors can help make that process smoother by being really clear about what is in their collection and how their collections might relate to other language records in the for the language as well. And I'll talk a bit about other types of grey literature in a little bit as well. Depositors can also review what is being archived and what is being left out when they create their collections. And this is something that the field of linguistics and others with interests in archiving and with a stake in what gets archived can contribute as well. So for example, there has been quite a bit of discussion around language documentation and archiving, that the types of language records made by academic linguists doing memory language documentation do not typically include the types of structures which are most useful for language reclamation, like greetings or kinship terms or child-directed speech or things like this. But this is a much wider issue which we could look at in more detail as well. In terms of language preservation as, language record preservation, this is of course the job of archives as well. When an archive takes a language collection, that is an implicit contract that that they will do their best to store those materials long term and make sure that nothing happens to them. But of course, depositors here can help with this as well. One thing we think about a bit is archive fragility. One thing we noticed in the collection that across the archives that we looked at was that they varied pretty extensively in how much information there was about the long-term preservations of their collections or the long-term setup of the archive. For instance, in the list of OLAC archive, or the list on OLAC of language archives, some of those archives are no longer accessible or accessible only through the Wayback Machine, whereas others have a commitment to long-term institutional funding. And so one thing we should be thinking about is archive fragility here. Actually, I have to bring up, because I said we weren't going to pick on any individual archive, but I think this is a really nice example, particularly since it's also now been fixed, that of archive fragility, that the British Library's Endangered Archives project, which mirrors or provides digital backup of collections of and archives in areas where preservation might be difficult. That entire site became unusable for about 8 months because of some breaks in systematic web links. The parent website converted to a new format of links, and those links were automatically updated, but the underlying collections were not. So this has now been fixed, but it goes to show that even well-resourced archives can be subject to this same sort of archive fragility as well. We would like to see a lot more information about how archives store and preserve the language materials that are being entrusted to them. We didn't track this simply because we couldn't. There were very few archives that provided information about their backup protocols or about their on-site or off-site materials and so on. And we think this is really, really crucial. Just as when we talk to our students about the importance of archiving in the first place and of backing up their personal materials, the same is true, of course, for archives as well. And we know that some archives have given extensive thought to this and have very robust protocols in place. So the Paradisec archive, for instance, there are papers available on their process and how they are tied into a much larger university infrastructure, but we don't have that information for the vast majority of the archives that we looked at. A third point, or rather Austin's third point, was to make the existence of the collections discoverable. And again, this is the job of archives, but depositors can help here too by providing clear, accurate, and structured metadata. The archives can consider issues around the language of the user interface, the languages used to navigate the site, other design components, and so on. Depositors could also help here in making sure that their archival collections are advertised robustly and in a format that also has longevity to the communities and stakeholders that they work with as well. We also know that there are larger issues here beyond individual depositors or individual archives or even individual or collective stewardship institutions such as universities. For instance, these issues of discoverability relate quite closely to how search results from search engines are ranked, indexed, and so on, how they are filtered by location and language, which can prioritize the needs of users of very large languages at the expense of users of minoritized languages. And we raised the issue that some sort of persistent identifiers, such as DOIs for collections, may be not a full solution, but one partial solution for this as well. And finally, one of the jobs of archives is to facilitate the appropriate distribution of the data and materials in the collections. And again, this is the job of archives, but depositors can help here too. There is, of course, a literature on who defines what appropriate distribution is, and we recognize that language collections are not a free-for-all. There's no inherent right that everyone should have access to every single piece of data collected about or by or for Indigenous language communities in particular. And so we're not advocating like everything should be open source, but archives can work to make access for different purposes and for different communities easier as well. And depositors can facilitate this by being extremely clear about what the expectations of communities are, and to make sure that there is a process in place for approving requests or knowing what types of requests are appropriate and what types are not. And so you've seen here that although Austin's principles are particularly about archives, both archives and depositors have a relationship here, and they both contribute to collectively to these to the processes of accessibility, discoverability, and functionality. So archive level protocols create standards that individual depositors can follow. As we've seen, there's a wide variety of metadata standards, and individual depositors using metadata in different ways and collecting it for and recording it to greater or lesser extents. And so archives can help with establishing protocols and precedents that individual depositors are expected to follow. Conversely, depositor level practices will uphold the consistency of archival materials and allow archives to fulfill their functions of inter-archive and intra-archive usability as well. So it's not just on the archives and it's not just on the depositors. These are communities who can and should work together for these as well. I should note that, and I'm going to come to this in about a minute or so, that there are issues here around things like metadata that where the protocols that were put in place or were unstated are no longer serving our needs fully. So for example, one issue about metadata is linking metadata, collection level metadata to individual file formats. For example, a collection may record the names of speakers or signers who are represented in the collections, but for using that collection, we really need to know which files are associated with which language users, and that might not be recorded. So this is one example where the, or it could be recorded in multiple different ways. Having metadata about the file in the file name is very useful for working computationally with materials, but that's at the expense of file name readability for humans. And so these sorts of things matter quite a lot. So we've talked a little bit about what archives and depositors can do to make their collections more findable and usable. Here's a brief summary of that. So in terms of what's archived, the format and the order of collections, how annotated and how metadated they are. So what sorts of annotations make it in, what sort of metadata is used and how consistent it is. Related to this is how we can consider the many different ways in which language data and language collections in archives are now used. So for example, they can be interacted with item by item, such as humans playing recordings, listening to or viewing recordings for individuals for specific reasons. Or these materials could be reformed or republished, for example, as a set of narratives being published as an oral history collection. These materials could be used by humans to make other resources in or about the language, such as drawing examples from field notes or recordings of narratives or conversation to make pedagogical materials. They could be used in extracting statistical information about the language. So not interacted on item by human, but rather parsed across the collection by a computer. Or they could be used to train computational models, for example, for speech to text, again, where the human user of the collection is at several points removed from the primary linguistic data. And some things that don't really matter for humans matter a lot for computers here and vice versa. So for instance, my example with file naming conventions just before, where rich file naming conventions that allow the extraction of metadata are very useful for looking computationally across a collection, but make it very difficult for humans to find what they want. And so some balance and some consideration of this may be what should be needed in future. I'd also like to make a point that here we have just been discussing archival language materials, but these archival materials could and should be linked to other types of ephemeral language records which are typically not archived for various reasons, such as grey literature, conference handouts, school and language center publications, publications in the language such as newspapers, podcasts, and so on. Public internet content as well, like tweets or TikToks or Insta pictures and so on. There's a growing use of these social media platforms for endangered language reclamation, endangered language promotion, making contexts across speech and signing communities and so on. And so we should be considering about what are appropriate uses and preservations of that type of data as well. And here is where not only community considerations come into play, but also appropriate use agreements for the platforms and so on as well. So all of this comes back to questions about why are materials being preserved, for what purpose, and who gets a say in what happens. And these are difficult questions. We're not trying to say anything otherwise. And so just to close now, we have this quote here from Bird and Simons from 2003, and this really kind of sums up what we're talking about, but it's also a flashback to 20 years ago. And so we've been talking about these items for many, many years now. So the very generation where the rate of language death is at its peak, we have chosen to use moribund technologies and to create endangered data. And so we'd like to stress this, this issue of multiple layers of endangerment and pressure for communities and for the language collections as well. And so for linguists who have worked long term with communities and who have made connections with communities and explicit or implicit promises to be participants in language reclamation programs for long term, these are things that we really have to consider. Okay, so to reiterate, we understand that this is a really complicated problem and that archives don't receive the funding they need and they rely on a great deal of volunteer energy and labor to function, that there are issues around funding for collections and documentation and so on. There are issues of precariety of employment and of who should have access, who should be making decisions around these these issues and so on. And so this is basically why we are doing this work. We want to start this conversation and continue this conversation about where archives and where linguists and where community members all work together for materials of this type. And so with this, thank you very much. Our slides and the handout have the references for the material. I'm actually going to now hand back to Irene to launch the poll because some things have been minimized and so on. So we actually have a couple of polls now which ask some questions. They're not tests on what we've talked about, but rather ways to get your opinion about the types of issues that we're raising. And we would also very much welcome we welcome all the questions that you have that about these sorts of collections for the remaining 25 minutes or so. So if you want to make a start with putting those in the question box as well.
Thanks, Claire. Okay.
We might actually want to stop sharing the screen and launch the poll as well. So.
Okay. Okay. Okay, I've just launched a poll, and the poll is, which of the following issues have you come across in your work with archives? And please select all that applies. So I'm watching the percentages of responses. 38% have voted. So we'll wait a little bit longer.
Will it cause issues if we stop screen sharing the blank screen as well?
Ooh,
so if we go up to like sharing at the top.
yes.
They can't see the screen. Oh, they can't see the screen. Okay, excellent.
Oh,
okay.
Oh, nice.
Awesome.
Oh,
Great. So we
gotcha.
need to, yeah,
Perfect.
let's not touch anything.
Yes. Okay, so it seems there seems to be a pause in the voting,
yeah,
so we can share the responses. I don't know what happened if I click close poll, so I'm just going to read out the responses first. Yeah, so 52% of people who answered the poll said that they've encountered file format issues. 76% said they have encountered missing or incorrect metadata. 73% have said they were unable to download files from the archive. 42% said that the quality of files was not sufficient, and 33% said they were unable to match transcripts to audio or video files. That is my computer screenshot sound. I'm just screenshotting the results. I'm going to close the poll now. Oh, and then you can share the results. Okay, cool. These are the results. Yes.
Okay, should we go to the next?
Yes. Okay, now we're gonna hide the results. The next one is, which of the following issues have you come across? Here we go. module. Okay, which of the following issues have you come across? Continued, because the poll function on this webinar platform only allows for a certain number of responses possible. So, and there is no function to type in. So if you have an other answer, please type that into the chat. Yeah, so we'll just wait.
Right, yeah, we are particularly interested in the other types of issues that we didn't come across in our relatively small collection or our relatively small review of materials. As Sarah mentioned, every time we looked at a new collection, new issues arose. Although I guess, as we saw from the previous collection, the previous poll, we're also seeing that many of the issues we have identified have also occurred in the materials that you have worked with. Right, and it looks like incomplete collections are also quite an issue.
Yes, I will close the poll and share the results so we can all see these. Oh, share the results. Yes, so as you can see, a large percentage of people who responded to the poll said that incomplete collections, files listed but unavailable was a problem. And yes, if you submitted other, please type what you found into the questions or the chat. You're gonna hear the screenshotting sound again. I'm just gonna screenshot that. Okay, hide the results. And finally, this poll question, which of the following tools would help you in your work? Please select all that apply. Yeah, a way to consistently record metadata, a way to keep track of what is in a collection, a tool or script which identifies likely problems in the collection. If you already use a tool that does all of these things, please check that. And yeah, and something else you can write in the chat or in the question section. And if you already use a tool that does all of these things and you want to share what tool that is,
right, because we could not think of any.
Yeah.
I guess that there are some that do some of these things. So, for instance, Lameta is a great tool for consistently recording metadata. A way to keep track of what's in a collection. Again, a metadata tool like Lameta or the Indie database, or one's own gigantic spreadsheet, or things like that. For tools which identify likely problems in a collection, we don't know of any offhand. We're considering developing one based on the issues that we've seen, but it would be great if that such a thing already exists. Okay, I think the response collection has stopped, so I'm going to close the poll and share the results. So it seems like, many of you would love a way to consistently record metadata and keep track of what is in a collection, and also would like a tool or script which identifies the likely problems. And yeah, if you answered that you already use a tool or have a system in place, or if you answered something else, please feel free to type that into the chat or in the questions. Right. I will put the link to Lameta in the chat. Irene, do you want to start looking at the questions? Yes. Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to hide the results, and that turns the camera back on. Oh yes. Wow. A lot of questions. Oh, okay. Oh, this. Okay. I'm gonna stop showing screen. Okay. Okay, so now do you just see me in that screen? Yes. Okay. Okay. Perfect. Okay. So the questions, okay. Okay, yeah, so Irene, I can't send chats to everyone, so I just pasted. Okay, I will send it to the, okay. This is, oh yeah. Okay. Do you want to come over here and look at the questions? Yeah. Okay, why don't I come around this side? And would you like me to handle the questions or divide them? Sure. Okay, so let's see. Can I see the Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So, so the first question is about archiving by an agency's own initiative versus serving as a depository. Right. So we have a number of different archives that have different relationships to the kind of parent institution that that they work with. So, but I think in pretty much every case, so there are differences for this as well. So so for instance, one example would be the CNRS language archive or the MPI, the language archive, which are part of the institutional repositories, as I understand it, for a much larger collection, and happen to include endangered language data, but they also include a lot of other things. Another example of a slightly different relationship would be the ILA archive, which is part of, at some level, the University of Texas, as in it's housed by the University of Texas and so on. But it is has been very much built by linguists and individuals who work with collections. And so these we did not investigate the different ways in which these relationships to institutions might affect what can be archived, or what sorts of changes to archives can be made, but we assume that this is a very complex question. Let's see. Can we share with us whether there are grants to maintain and update existing digital archives, and which agencies and organizations offer maintenance grants? I know of a couple of examples for this, not a huge number, but if I remember right, the ELDP, Endangered Language Documentation Program grants, includes there is a call for papers for working on digital archive, for digitally archiving or creating or working with collections. The National Endowment for the Humanities also has a program like that, and the National Science Foundation DLI program, documenting language infrastructure, if I remember right, also has a fellowship program which can include things like archiving or working with collections. So those are the main areas that I'm aware of. But if there are others, please add them to the chat, and we can publicize those as well. So Jorge has a question about, so one of the missions of digital archives is to increase discoverability. And OLAC was conceived as a kind of clearinghouse, but I found that it's not reliable. I just checked again for 3 languages that I'm familiar with, and I've been told in the past that this was supposed to be updated daily. So did we look into OLAC, and why are existing collections not being indexed? Yes and no, I guess is the answer. So we did look into OLAC in that we went through OLAC to identify archives, and a number of the archives we worked with use OLAC as are both indexed in OLAC and use OLAC as a way to identify additional resources about the language. We also find OLAC quite difficult to use in both from a human point of view in terms of figuring out what's what, and also in terms of how materials are collated and identified within collections for OLAC. I'm sort of talking and also trying to remember some of the issues that came up. So there were some things around circularity, and some other things around things that were identified as archives or repositories which were not in fact adding to the materials about the language. So for instance, and I'm speaking from memory here, so I apologize if I, especially to OLAC if I get this wrong, but my memory of looking up things like Bardi, for example, is that there are a bunch of sites and resources that mention Bardi, but some of these things include say the ethnologue entry for Bardi, which does not include language materials, but it includes some information, say, about the language community. Or there's glottolog, which includes entries for some of the published resources for Bardi, but again, not others. There's items that link themselves to clearinghouses for collections. So there's a certain circularity around OLAC metadata that that makes it quite difficult to use as a primary entry point into collections. I am not surprised that there are materials that OLAC does not know about. I think part of the issue is that OLAC indexes, so OLAC sites are supposed to be updated, but I don't know what the infrastructure is between the individual collections and the OLAC site itself. I should look into this because as the maintainer of the Chirula database, there's a lot of material in there which is in theory public, but in practice quite difficult to find. So thank you for bringing that up, and that's something we'll look at in more detail. Oh, right. So we have some other. So Irene and Sarah, do you want to like take some of these questions? Feel free to put them back if like send them back to me if need be. But I don't want to do all the
Sure.
Right. So we're up to Jackson's.
Yeah. So we have some notes from the other categories from our poll questions. So this one says either can't find contact information or for help, or contact email doesn't work or is unresponsive. So that's another issue that's come up with archives, which I don't think that we had come across, although we didn't necessarily systematically try to contact you know, the contact email for all of these.
Right. There was one archive where we had to send an email for access, and it took about a week, but we did get it.
Yes, yeah. Okay, another one. Only because there is not an option to say none of the above. Oh, okay, yes. What tools do people use to record data? I mean, there are many options. I think there's, you know, some standard, really high quality, you know, separate recorders that you can buy or that universities often have. On top of that, you know, especially in light of recent events, remote recording is becoming more important and maybe more desirable for many reasons. Yeah, there's a paper in Language from December, this past December, that's all about remote recording and looking at the accuracy in terms of the phonetic signal of various different remote recording options. So I think we're going to send a link to that paper in light of this question. And yeah, there are some decent remote recording options, which are also, you know, could be local, you know, computer-based recording if, you know, purchase of a separate, you know, fancy recorder isn't available. There are trade-offs, of course, but it's a much more accessible way of recording things. Okay, to question number 2, inconsistent or otherwise poor transcription. Yes, so I mean, that's, yeah, we came across a number of transcription issues, whether it's inconsistencies or, you know, sort of notes, or, you know, the person doing the transcribing wasn't sure what was actually being said, so it's sort of like XXX, or sometimes the transcription is the actual sentence that was meant, but there were sort of hesitations or repetitions or something. So when you're trying to do forced alignment on that, that sort of trips up the system. But again, it's one of those things that's a little bit easier for humans, but is you know, an issue for computational things.
I guess another is recording variation in the I'll just come over here as well. So another thing we found a number of times was the recording of other variants or other linguistic information in the transcript line itself. So, for example, say the original recording had a particular word, there might be other alternative words which would also have served that purpose there. Or in code switched data, sometimes the transcript will have a non-code switched equivalent. And yeah, so we had a number of examples like that.
Let's see, clear explanations of vocabulary would go a long way, considering that we keep spouting stuff off about community availability. I'm not quite sure if this is vocabulary in what sense.
Right, the community of availability and accessibility might mean many different things depending on the community. So, for example, something that's accessible to a community with broadband internet will be quite different from a community where the internet connection is much less stable, or community access for language users where the archive is within walking or reasonable travel distance is very different from where the archive is on the other side of the country.
Right, yeah, and it can mean, you know, a number of different things. It could mean leaving hard copies of things with communities. But another big thing that we didn't go into too much was mobile access, because it, you know, in a lot of places, maybe not everyone has their own computer, but it's increasingly likely that they have their own phone or their tablet. And so mobile access to these materials could be really useful as well.
Right, yeah, there's Sarah and I were at the Paradisec at 100 conference last year, and there were some examples of Raspberry Pi systems being set up in remote Aboriginal communities. So of course there are many issues around access to language data through phones and tablets. One is just whether the websites have are set up in a way that facilitate access through phones and tablets. Another is issues around data, reliability of the connection, bandwidth use. In Australia, many plans have pretty strict data limits and storage and things like that as well. And so the Raspberry Pi solution creates a community-wide local server that individuals can access without cutting into their data plan limits, and it's stored through the Raspberry Pi system, so they don't have to use local phone storage for materials and so on as well. So that seems like a pretty effective way of creating a local repository for such materials. It can be maintained remotely to at least some extent, and so on as well.
This may be our last question, seeing as we're coming up on 1:30. As someone who works in archives digital collections, I would say that it would be useful for a digital asset management system to be accessible both by digital collection staff and archive creators and content stakeholders. Might be less of a tool and more of a workflow consideration.
Right. Yeah, that's a really great. Oh, sorry, I didn't want to.
Oh, no, go ahead.
That's yeah, no, that's a really great point. And we did not look at CMS content management systems at all, except to note that there's a combination of bespoke systems and standard, more standard systems like Omega or Mokoto or DSpace and a couple of others as well. But that information was not readily accessible through most archive sites, so we were unable to look at that in more detail. But yeah, but putting the linguist in as part, or the depositor, sorry, as part of the workflow is a nice idea, and it may well get around a number of these issues.
Yes, really quickly, there is one question that just says what causes offset in the ELAN files and how to avoid it. So basically the offset is just when the first boundary does not start at the beginning of the file. And so that needs to be specified in the settings file. Otherwise, the first boundary will just begin at the very beginning of the file. And then, you know, as a ripple effect, that will affect the alignment of everything.
Right. Yeah. So to avoid it, don't use file offsets. Yeah. So they're not included by default.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So it's almost 1:30. I think, I don't know if, yes, Mark is coming back. Okay.
I am coming back to thank everyone for, well, first to thank our presenters so much for such an interesting program, and to thank all of you for joining us. This has been recorded. It will be posted later on YouTube, on our YouTube channel, and you will all also receive a link in a follow-up email, and we will remind you once again in the coming LSA update on Monday. So thanks to our presenters, thanks to everyone for attending. This software ends somewhat abruptly, so the only way I can end the broadcast is to literally kick everyone out. So don't take that personally. Anyway, thanks again, and we'll see you all at the next webinar. Take care.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for coming.